Good morning. Tonight is the new year in the Jewish calendar. It's called Rosh Hashanah. What Jewish people do on Rosh Hashanah is they pray and reflect on the year past and things that they may have wanted to change and do differently and to become a better person. So I wish you all a happy new year on the Jewish calendar, and I hope that you enjoy the video lecture tonight. I wanted to begin our class with a discussion about, or thinking about, research as a systematic process. I want you to think about what a process means. A process is ongoing. So today, we have to shift our thinking and consider how our work is ongoing. There are many steps that have to be taken in order to get to the product of our assignment, of the final manuscript. It's not an assignment that you could think about the night before it's due and be finished with that assignment by the next morning. So let's start with how I see research or quantitative research. And one day I was just thinking about this and decided to search out the web to look at definitions of research and found this word cloud. I've given you the link here. At any rate, what you see on this word cloud are the words, obviously research being the largest, and then you see attached to research the idea of knowledge, of experiment, a probe, thinking. So I want you to think about our research process as engaging you in the development of knowledge, in experimentation possibly, where you might actually intervene with some kind of manipulation of variables, and possibly a new way of thinking about your approach to knowledge and the way that you gain knowledge, I think, might change as a result of our class. So think about research as a systematic process for observing and recording information. Think about it. We're going to observe information and we're going to record it. It's an integration of research, design, and statistics. And this is what I love about our new design for 250 and 251, because it allows me in quantitative research methods to be able to look at many designs and then to understand how to analyze those designs with appropriate statistics. You'll be able to take one of these statistics and make an application of it on a design that you've come up with for our class. We're going to have a set of very detailed procedures, and those procedures should be detailed in such a way that anybody could replicate those procedures. And you want them to be able to replicate them exactly the same, because replication in research, and you'll see in just a second, is extremely important and an issue that has been focused on over the last several years. What that means, replications, is that we could repeat or confirm findings. In order to be able to repeat or to detail our procedures in a really detailed way, we want to possibly do pilot testing, and that will help us to have very good measurement procedures. So several years ago, I was reading the New York Times, and there was an article entitled "Many Psychology Findings Not as Strong as Claims," study says. And basically what this study goes into is how very few psychology studies are replicated, and in fact, when in fact they are replicated, are the findings the same from study to study. I want to bring your attention to a few other studies on replication. In kinesiology, 3 authors, Mark Fishman, Bob Christina, and Greg Anson, who were all at Penn State at one point or another. Fishman and Anson were students at Penn State under the direction of Bob Christina. Bob Christina spent a very long career at Penn State and eventually became the dean at the University of North Carolina, I believe Greensboro. When Anson began to do his dissertation work, they tried to replicate the experiment of Henry. And what the researchers found was that they were unable to replicate the apparatus as it was explained by Henry in the memory drum theory. What's very important here is that the memory drum theory in motor learning is an extremely important paper that revolutionized thinking in motor behavior with regard to the motor program. Also, Henry's paper is one of the most cited papers in all of the Research Quarterly for Exercise and Sport history. His paper was published in the 1960s, and it still holds that record today. So the point is that Henry had a major error or flaw in his publication that is referred to in so many other papers and granted the position of changing the pathway for the study of motor behavior, and there is a mistake in that paper. So it shows how doing replication of work is of utmost importance to make sure that all work is systematic and correct. In the Jones, Derby, and Schmidlin article, this is a human factors piece that was published in the journal Human Factors. Many of you know that I've been involved with the Human Factors Ergonomics program that's housed in the College of Engineering. In this study, Jones and his colleagues investigated the prevalence of replication in human factors research. What they tried to do was uncover parent articles, in other words, articles that were the first to study a certain phenomenon or issue, and to understand how many child articles there were underneath those parent articles, and whether or not those child articles were exact publications, replications, or partial replications. What they found was that many of these replications were exact and some were partial replications. A student of mine, Soraya Rhodes, actually replicated or used the Jones, Derby, and Schmidlin method and replicated that in a motor learning study looking at the effects of video replay, a very prevalent topic in motor learning and coaching. And what Soraya wanted to know is, what is the incidence of replication in the area of knowledge of results or feedback research? When she was doing her work, she uncovered an open, large-scale collaborative effort to estimate the reproducibility of psychological science open science collection or collaboration, I suggest that some of you might want to go out and study some of these things for possibly a Plan B project. So our method or process for conducting research is the scientific method. In the scientific method, the very first thing we do is we identify a problem. You know that the problem is not a problem in the world, but rather it is an issue that you've discovered is important in the research literature. Problems are developed only by understanding directions of research and to really embed yourself in the scholarly and professional literature. When I use the terminology scholarly, I ask you, do you understand what that means? Scholarly literature is actually literature that is peer-reviewed by experts. Sometimes Dr. Siebert and I will go to our mailboxes and we'll find articles that have not yet been published in the literature. We're asked to review those articles and make a decision. Yes, we want to publish this article as is. Yes, we want to publish this article, but with major revisions. Or no, we don't think this article is worth publishing. And from this literature, this scholarly literature, we can then come up with basic questions or applied questions that are important in our professional communities. Also, through our professional newsletters and other forms, we could become interested in applied issues, but we still need to document our understanding, our knowledge of these issues by presenting a scholarly review of the literature. So any good researcher investigates and then reviews source materials. What this means is that you have to gather information and in gathering this information, you want to use both supportive and contrary research so that you're trying to not provide a set of biases into your literature. Based upon that literature, you're going to create a set of hypotheses. You'll design a method based upon those hypotheses, and that method is developed to help you to test your hypotheses. In the earlier slide, I said that I thought your methods had to be very prescriptive. I want you to think about baking a cake. If you were to bake a cake based on the fact that you loved my cake, you would want me to give you all of the instructions for making the cake so that when your cake came out, it would taste exactly like my cake. If I forgot to give you the cocoa, then yours would not come out as a chocolate cake. And so the method has to be described in such a way that every cake will come out exactly the same, if in fact the same ingredients are used. And then the final piece of the scientific method is to analyze and interpret the results. What does the study actually say? Finally, we discuss the results and we draw conclusions. And here's where I have to say to all of you, be very careful in your conclusions. Make sure that the findings you present, the conclusions you draw, are based upon the findings you get, not upon the original contentions that you might have had. What are your findings? Did you find differences? It's possible that, in fact, you did support the hypotheses that you proposed. But oftentimes, we don't support those hypotheses. We have to make sure that we don't lapse into trying to support those hypotheses, even when, in fact, our data don't support those directions. So what is knowledge? Knowledge is made up of facts and theories. Facts are things that we have replicated, ideas that we have replicated over and over again, and we could call those facts. Theories, on the other hand, are propositions. They are not things that we are sure of, though we base our theories on intelligent thought. Knowledge enables us to understand phenomena and also to be able to solve problems. So we could look at two continua. You could see here the first continuum is a continuum from theoretical research to empirical research. A second continuum is one from basic research to applied research. Notice that theoretical research is conducted to explain very large-scale phenomena. In other words, the theoretician will take facts that are discovered through empirical research, and they will try to, through conjecture, create inferences that then can be used by the empirical researcher. These inferences are actually hypotheses that are presented by the theoretical researchers. Empirical research is conducted by the observation of phenomena in the lab or in the field. Empiricists apply rigorous scientific procedures that are trusted and then peer-reviewed. And so notice that the empiricist uses the hypotheses that are developed in these theoretical models, so that guides the that guides the empirical research that's conducted in our labs and on our fields. On the other continuum, from basic to applied, basic research helps us to uncover underlying phenomena. For example, I could just look at the mitochondria and what occurs in the mitochondria when exposed in an oxygen-rich versus an oxygen-deprived environment. Notice that I'm just doing this for the basic knowledge, but I could also make application of that knowledge by applying it in practical settings and making application in the real world. For example, what is the muscular response of climbers on Mount Everest in both oxygen-enriched and under hypoxic or oxygen-deprived conditions? So you could see here how research by kinesiologists can occur in any of these dimensions or any of these quadrants. There are applied theoretical strategies or ideas. There are applied empirical studies, basic empirical studies, and basic theoretical studies. How do we gain knowledge? Well, we gain knowledge through first-hand observation. That would be empiricism. We also gain knowledge through second-hand sources. Those are sources that are once removed from the observers. As researchers, we don't trust second-hand information unless its source materials are well tested. Examples of secondary source materials that is acceptable are anthologies. Anthologies are collections of sometimes theoretical ideas and often review papers by experts on very specific topics in biomechanics, aging and motor behavior, cerebral palsy and exercise physiology, and so forth. Reliability and validity are important measurement strategies in research. Reliability means consistency. Is your information, are your data reproducible? Validity means representation, and it has many forms. The first way that I want you to look at validity, and we'll look at this again in a slide set that I call measurement theory. Validity, internal validity, means the accuracy of an instrument or an apparatus to measure the ideas or the notions that you say you're measuring. So if I have a personality questionnaire, is that questionnaire really measuring personality? If I have a reaction timer, is that measure actually measuring reaction time? If I have an ECG cap, is that cap actually measuring ECG, electrocardiography? And does the measure what it purports to measure? So oftentimes when talking about validity, the word purports, supposed to, is the word that's used to understand validity. External validity means, does the information generalize to greater populations? So if I do a study at San Jose State, do my data generalize to all four-year institutions in every state of the country, whether it be private or public institutions? I think that possibly our student body may represent a different type of student than a student body at the University of Nebraska. Ecological validity means, does the study reflect real-world experience? A great example of this would be running on a treadmill with all kinds of apparatus connected with gas analysis and no wind in a lab. Does that really reflect running a marathon in Colorado in the winter? So you could see that we need to understand all of the internal, external, and ecological validity pieces as they're reflected in our studies. You have to have reliability in order to establish validity. But validity is not required to establish reliability. In other words, you could have a measure that's consistent, but it's not actually measuring what you say it's measuring. So if I say that I'm going to measure your reaction time using an old-fashioned stopwatch, and I wait for the gun to go off or a stimulus to go off, and I start the stopwatch, and then I look to see when you stopped your stopwatch, I stopped my stopwatch. Now I have two of my reaction times contained in your reaction time. Is that truly a valid measure of your reaction time? But in fact, each time I measure your reaction time, I measure it the same way. Can you make an example of how reliability is required for validity, but why validity is not required for reliability. If a measure is measuring what it says it's measuring, then it has to measure it consistently. Otherwise, we wouldn't know what it's measuring. So, a couple of cautions for you to consider as you step out on this pathway or on this journey for the first piece of research as a graduate student. The first thing that I want you to start to think about is your own perceptions, biases, and expectations that could, in fact, create some problems with unreliability with first-hand observations. And I want you to also be careful about any assumptions that you might have going into your research. In other words, here's an example. Do you have hegemonic interpretations of biological differences between the sexes, between the races, between ages, or between disabilities? In other words, do you see females as less than, people of other races as less than, people who are older as less than, people who are disabled as less than? These are areas of study and involve androcentric bias, ethnocentric bias, and so forth. I want you to consider how personal assumptions may lead to a set of expectations that you can have. And so you want to try to reduce this bias and to eliminate these expectations. In the education discipline, we call these Rosenthal effects or Pygmalion effects. Rosenthal was the researcher who first identified these effects in research. A pedagogy researcher, Thomas Martinick, actually published an article in the Research Quarterly for Exercise and Sport in 1981 called Pygmalion in the Gym. It's an area that you might want to consider for your research. And then also to reduce, wherever possible, any kind of secondhand information that may lack validity and may lack reliability. So what are some ways that we have for obtaining information? We might go to an authority like a professor, a religious leader. We might rely on our own personal experience. Or we might use the process of deduction, which is what theoretical researchers do. In other words, if A equals B and B equals C, then we can deduct or infer that A equals C. Notice we call this the syllogism. In the syllogism, there are a set of premises, and then there's a conclusion that we can draw from those premises. Induction is is observational. Empirical researchers engage in the process of induction. Induction sets the principles or the premises for deduction, and then these theoretical researchers could induce the conclusion. So in the scientific method, there are steps for us to follow in order to gain information. It's a process for us to identify and observe and collect information. We identify a problem, we review the literature, we develop a method, conduct the research, analyze the results, and finally discuss and conclude the results. I've asked you for September 24th to submit to October 1st. You'll be submitting your IRB certificates to Canvas into the assignments page. When you go out to the IRB training, I want you to pay particular attention to the Belmont Report. There are 3 components in the Belmont Report. Those are respect for persons through the informed consent, beneficence, which is risk and benefit, and justice, how subjects are actually selected for our experiments. I want you to pay particular attention to ethics in research. So we at San Jose State University and any institution of higher education have institutional review boards, or what are referred to as human subjects committees. Our institutional review board at San Jose State uses the city training. Go to this link here and do the city training for human subjects training. You're going to find information about the National Research Act. Kroll wrote about the National Research Act in Quest in 1993. You need to explain the experimental nature of your research, to describe any reasonably foreseeable risk or discomfort that may come to the subject, to describe benefits to the subjects that may be reasonably expected. You need to disclose any alternative procedures or courses of treatment that might be advantageous to a subject. You have to provide a statement of how confidentiality will be protected in your study. You need to provide a statement of the risks and the benefits to the subjects. And finally, provide a statement that participation is voluntary, and if the subjects were going to withdraw from the experiment, they could withdraw without penalty. Cardinal in 1996 in Research Quarterly for Exercise and Sport published an article about the readability of written informed consent in exercise and sport psychology research. And also in Pediatric Exercise Science many years ago, the editor wrote about selecting children as subjects and how to recruit them, to care for them, and to nurture them. So let's just talk a little bit about the publication of research data. Manuscript should not be published in more than one place, unless the manuscript is clearly identified as a reprint. This way, copyright is not violated. Permission has been given to reprint the manuscript. In research notes, oftentimes older data is used for a reinterpretation, for a new interpretation of data. This would not be considered unethical. Also, when you're publishing your project or your thesis, copyright laws apply to tables and figures and images. You must get permission from the copyright owner to use your data. And of course, for our class, you're going to be fabricating data, which in our case is okay, but is really unethical in the real world. Finally, let's just talk about order of authorship. I strongly believe that this is something that you need to talk to your mentors about as you go off into your Plan Bs and your theses. If the professor gave you the topic and basically wrote the paper for you, then there's no question in my mind that the professor's name ought to be on the publication and could possibly even be the first author of the publication. However, if the student came up with the idea entirely, if the student did almost all of the work on the manuscript, but the professor contributed many hours of ideas and comments and editorial remarks, then the professor's name should be on the publication. The order of authorship should be an example of how much contribution did each team member make to the manuscript or to the publication. So for our class next week, I want you to have a little fun. Go out to this link, a New York Times article from Sunday, September 2017. I want you to read the whole article, and I also want you to explore the interactive graphic that's provided here. Next week, bring your APA manual to class. Finally, I want you to think about time management so that you can get to the last of our class. I want you to think about what are the steps that are going to get you from now to the first submission, from the first submission to the second submission, and then the second submission to the final submission. Look at the material that I've already posted. You need 5 scholarly articles to get to September 24th. You have to review all of those articles to get there. You need another 5 scholarly articles and another paper to submit by October 29th. And finally, a 20-page manuscript that is complete to get to December 10th. What are the steps that you're going to engage in to get you from these dates that I've placed into this table and the dates that you're going to add? Where are you in terms of the status of that work? I'd like for you to bring a copy of this to class next week. It could be an electronic copy that you're keeping, or it could be a print copy. Have a great week, everybody. I look forward to seeing you next Monday.